You're standing in a medieval church watching a woman plunge her bare hand into a cauldron of boiling water. She's required to retrieve a stone from the bottom, hold it, and then walk 3 paces before she can release it. Her hand will be bandaged immediately, then examined 3 days later. If the wound has healed cleanly, she's innocent. If it shows signs of infection or festering, she's guilty. There's no jury. No lawyers. No witnesses testifying about what they saw. Just her hand, the boiling water, and God. Because in medieval Europe, for over 500 years, this is how justice worked. Courts didn't decide guilt or innocence. God did. And the method God used was your body's ability to withstand physical torture. But here's what nobody tells you about trial by ordeal: it actually worked far better than you'd think, not because God was intervening, but because the priests running these trials understood human psychology and had secret methods that made the outcome surprisingly fair. If you want to understand how medieval justice operated, why people genuinely trusted these brutal tests, and the shocking reason the Catholic Church suddenly banned them, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what you're about to discover about trial by ordeal will completely change how you think about medieval law, religious authority, and whether our modern system is actually that much better. Trial by ordeal was the dominant form of criminal justice in medieval Europe from roughly the 6th century until it was banned in 1215. That's over 600 years. For comparison, the entire history of the United States is only about 250 years. Trial by ordeal wasn't some brief experiment or regional quirk. It was the standard, accepted, universal method for determining guilt when evidence was unclear. And it was based on a single, simple premise: God knows the truth, and God will reveal it through physical tests. The logic was theological but straightforward. Humans lie. Witnesses can be mistaken or corrupted. Evidence can be ambiguous. But God cannot be deceived and will not allow the innocent to suffer. Therefore, if you subject an accused person to a physical ordeal that would normally cause harm, and God protects them from that harm, they must be innocent. If God allows them to be harmed, they must be guilty. It's divine judgment made visible through the human body. This wasn't considered primitive or superstitious by medieval standards. It was considered the most reliable form of justice possible. You weren't trusting human judgment, which everyone knew was fallible. You were trusting God's judgment, which was perfect. In a deeply religious society where God's presence in the world was accepted as obvious fact, trial by ordeal made perfect sense. There were several types of ordeal, each designed to test God's intervention in different ways. The most common was ordeal by hot iron. The accused would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specific distance, usually 9 feet. The iron was heated in a church fire until it glowed. The accused would grasp it with their bare hand and walk the required distance. Their hand would then be wrapped in cloth and sealed, and 3 days later the bandages would be removed and examined by a priest. Clean healing meant innocence. Infection or festering meant guilt. Ordeal by boiling water worked similarly. A stone or ring would be placed at the bottom of a cauldron of boiling water. The accused had to plunge their hand or arm into the water to retrieve the object. Sometimes the object was placed at wrist depth, sometimes elbow depth, depending on the severity of the accusation. More serious crimes required reaching deeper into the boiling water. Again, the hand or arm would be bandaged, sealed, and examined 3 days later. Ordeal by cold water was different. The accused would be bound and lowered into a body of blessed water. The theory was that water, having been blessed, would reject evil. If the person sank, they were innocent because the pure water accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty because the water rejected their sinful body. This ordeal was most commonly used for accusations of witchcraft and became particularly popular during the later witch-hunting periods. Ordeal by combat was reserved for people of higher social status and for certain types of disputes. If two parties had conflicting claims and no clear evidence, they could fight a duel. God would strengthen the arm of the righteous party. The winner was legally correct. This type of ordeal continued longer than the others and evolved into formal dueling codes that persisted into the early modern period. There was also ordeal by consecrated bread, used particularly for clergy accused of crimes. The accused would be given a piece of blessed bread or cheese to swallow. If they could swallow it without choking, they were innocent. If they choked, God was preventing them from consuming the blessed food, proving guilt. This may sound absurd, but remember that choking is often triggered by anxiety. A guilty person, knowing they were guilty and fearing divine judgment, might genuinely have difficulty swallowing. The process of ordeal wasn't casual or immediate. It was elaborate, ritualized, and surrounded by religious ceremony designed to emphasize the spiritual significance of what was happening. Let's walk through a typical ordeal by hot iron to understand how it actually worked. First, the accused would typically spend 3 days preparing spiritually. They would fast, pray, attend Mass, and sometimes undergo confession. This wasn't just spiritual preparation. It was psychological conditioning. 3 days of fasting, fear, and religious ritual would put anyone in an altered mental state. On the day of the ordeal, the entire community would gather at the church. This was a public event, witnessed by everyone. The accused would enter the church and hear a special Mass focused on divine judgment and God's ability to reveal truth. Specific prayers would be said asking God to intervene, to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. The iron would be blessed. The fire would be blessed. Sometimes the accused hand would be blessed. Everything was consecrated and made holy, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't a human test but a divine one. Then came the moment. The accused would approach the fire. The priest would remove the glowing iron using tongs and place it on a stand or in the accused hand. The accused would be required to walk the designated distance, usually 9 feet, while carrying or grasping the iron. Witnesses would verify they completed the full distance. Immediately after, the hand would be wrapped tightly in cloth, and the wrapping would be sealed, often with wax and the priest's or judge's seal. This prevented tampering. The accused would be sent home and told to maintain the bandage without touching it for 3 days. 3 days later, the community would gather again at the church. The seal would be broken. The bandages would be removed. And the priest would examine the wound. This is the crucial moment where interpretation happened. What constituted clean healing versus festering? The guidelines were surprisingly vague. Some legal codes specified that any sign of infection meant guilt. Others said the wound should be healing cleanly, without defining exactly what that meant. This ambiguity gave the examining priest significant discretion in determining the outcome. And here's where trial by ordeal gets interesting, because modern research suggests that the priests and judges running these ordeals actually manipulated them to produce fair outcomes far more often than random chance would predict. In 2010, Peter Leeson, an economist at George Mason University, published a paper analyzing the historical evidence around trial by ordeal. He argued that the system worked surprisingly well, not through divine intervention, but through a combination of psychology, priestly manipulation, and institutional design. First, the psychology. The elaborate religious ceremony created immense pressure on guilty parties to confess before the ordeal. If you had actually committed the crime, and you believed God would expose you through the ordeal, the 3 days of preparation became 3 days of psychological torture. You knew God knew the truth. You knew you couldn't fool God. Many people confessed during the preparation period rather than face the ordeal itself. The ordeals that actually preceded were often cases where the accused genuinely believed in their innocence. Second, the priestly manipulation. Priests controlled crucial aspects of the ordeal, and there's evidence they used that control to influence outcomes. The temperature of the iron could vary significantly. A piece of iron that's red hot but not white hot will cause burns, but potentially survivable ones. An iron heated to maximum temperature will cause devastating third-degree burns. A priest who believed the accused was probably innocent might ensure the iron wasn't heated to absolute maximum temperature. The examination process after 3 days also left room for interpretation. A priest who believed in the accused innocence might judge ambiguous healing as sufficient. One who believed in guilt might interpret the same wound as showing signs of festering. There were no objective medical standards. It was judgment call. Third, the institutional design. Trial by ordeal was expensive and time-consuming. It required church cooperation, public assembly, multiple ceremonies. This meant it was reserved for difficult cases where evidence was genuinely unclear. Simple cases with clear evidence didn't go to ordeal. They were decided by testimony and proof. Ordeal was the method of last resort when the legal system was genuinely uncertain. Historical records show surprisingly high acquittal rates for ordeal. In cases where we have documentation, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of people who underwent ordeal were declared innocent. That's much higher than you'd expect if the outcomes were purely random or if the system was designed simply to punish accused people. This high acquittal rate makes sense when you understand how selection worked. Guilty people who confessed before ordeal were already removed from the pool. People who went through with ordeal were disproportionately those who genuinely believed in their innocence. And priests who controlled the examination had discretion to interpret ambiguous results favorably. But here's the question: did people at the time know the system was being manipulated? Almost certainly not. The priests themselves probably believed they were interpreting God's will. When you examine a wound 3 days after an ordeal and have to decide if it's healing cleanly or showing infection, you're making a judgment call informed by your assessment of the case. A priest who believed the accused was innocent would unconsciously look for signs of clean healing. One who believed them guilty would notice signs of infection. They weren't lying. They were interpreting ambiguous evidence through their existing beliefs, which is exactly what humans do all the time. And for the community, the outcome seemed to come from God. They saw the religious ceremony. They saw the accused grasp burning iron. They saw the sealed bandage. They saw the priest examine the wound 3 days later and declare God's judgment. The system had credibility because it had divine authority behind it. Trial by ordeal also solved a real problem in medieval justice: how do you decide cases when you don't have reliable evidence? Medieval Europe didn't have forensic science, fingerprinting, DNA testing, or sophisticated investigative techniques. Most crimes didn't have witnesses. If someone accused you of theft and there was no clear proof either way, how should the court decide? Modern courts would say the burden of proof is on the accuser and would acquit if evidence is insufficient. But medieval society found that unsatisfying. It meant guilty people would go free. Trial by ordeal offered a solution: when human judgment fails, invoke divine judgment. God knows the truth, so ask God. This also helped with legitimacy. A court ruling based on human judgment could be questioned. People could argue the judge was biased, the witnesses were lying, the evidence was misinterpreted. But a ruling from God, revealed through ordeal, was beyond question. You couldn't appeal God's decision. Except, of course, you could. And people did. Failed ordeals could sometimes be appealed, though the grounds were limited. You could argue the ordeal wasn't conducted properly, that the ritual was flawed somehow, that the examination was premature. Some people underwent second ordeals. But these were exceptions. Most ordeal outcomes were final. Different regions and time periods had variations in how ordeals worked. The Franks, Germans, and Anglo-Saxons all used ordeal but with slightly different procedures and standards. The Church tried to standardize practices but was never completely successful. Local variations persisted. One interesting variation was the use of ordeal for property disputes. If two people claimed ownership of the same land or object, and neither could prove their claim, they might be required to undergo ordeal. Whoever passed was granted ownership. This effectively used religious authority to settle civil disputes that had no clear evidence. Women and men were generally subject to the same ordeals, though there's some evidence that women were more likely to face cold water ordeal, particularly in witchcraft accusations. Men of high status were more likely to be offered trial by combat rather than hot iron or boiling water. Social status mattered in medieval justice, and ordeal was no exception. So trial by ordeal worked reasonably well, at least compared to alternatives available at the time, for over 500 years. Why did it end? The answer is sudden and specific. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, a major gathering of Catholic Church leaders called by Pope Innocent III, banned clergy from participating in trials by ordeal. Canon 18 of the Fourth Lateran Council stated that clergy could not participate in ordeals involving fire or hot water or cold water or combat. Since ordeals required priestly blessing and examination to have legitimacy, this effectively ended the practice throughout Catholic Europe. Why did the Church ban it? The official reason was theological. The Fourth Lateran Council was part of a broader reform movement in the Church that emphasized reason, education, and proper theology. The Reformers argued that trial by ordeal was essentially forcing God to perform miracles on demand. It was treating God like a tool for human convenience. It was presumptuous and potentially blasphemous to assume God would intervene in every local legal dispute. There was also a practical concern. The Church was becoming more centralized and bureaucratic. Trial by ordeal gave tremendous power to local priests who could influence outcomes. The central church authorities wanted more control over legal processes and less local variation. But there's probably another factor: the Church was seeing the limitations of the system. As legal thinking became more sophisticated in the 12th and early 13th centuries, scholars were developing better methods of evidence evaluation, witness examination, and logical reasoning. Universities were training lawyers and judges in Roman legal principles that emphasized evidence and argument rather than divine signs. Trial by ordeal was starting to look primitive compared to these newer methods. The ban created a crisis in medieval justice. Suddenly, courts that had relied on ordeal for difficult cases had no clear method for resolving them. Different regions responded differently. England developed the jury system, where a group of local people would evaluate evidence and render a verdict. Continental Europe developed inquisitorial procedures where judges would actively investigate cases and evaluate evidence. Both systems still exist today in various forms. The transition wasn't immediate or smooth. Some regions continued using ordeal unofficially for decades after 1215. Some simply ignored the ban for certain types of cases, particularly witchcraft accusations. The cold water ordeal for witches persisted in various places well into the 17th century, despite official church condemnation. But by the mid-13th century, trial by ordeal had largely disappeared from official legal procedures across Europe. It was replaced by systems that relied on human judgment, juries, judges, examination of evidence, testimony of witnesses. All the things we consider normal justice today. Was this an improvement? In some ways, obviously yes. Human judgment based on evidence is more reliable than assuming God will make people's burns heal or not heal based on their guilt. But in other ways, it's not as clear-cut as you might think. Trial by ordeal had high acquittal rates, probably around 70. Modern criminal justice systems have conviction rates around 90 for cases that go to trial. That means ordeal was actually more likely to find you innocent than a modern jury is. Of course, modern trials work from better evidence and more serious cases, so the comparison isn't perfect. But it should make us cautious about assuming medieval justice was simply inferior to ours. Trial by ordeal also provided closure and legitimacy. When God declared you innocent through ordeal, your reputation was restored. Your accuser couldn't continue to spread rumors about your guilt. The community accepted the outcome. Modern acquittals don't always provide that. You can be found not guilty and still face social stigma, employment discrimination, and suspicion. And trial by ordeal was relatively egalitarian for its time. Rich and poor alike could undergo the same test. A peasant's hand responded to burning iron the same way a nobleman's did, at least in theory. Modern justice systems, despite their ideals, are notoriously biased by wealth. Better lawyers, better investigation, better presentation of your case, all of these correlate with money. None of this means trial by ordeal was actually good or should be revived. It was based on supernatural beliefs that weren't true. It subjected innocent people to genuine physical harm. It gave priests enormous power to manipulate outcomes. But it wasn't quite the barbaric, arbitrary system we often imagine. It was a sophisticated attempt to solve real problems in administering justice with the tools and beliefs available at the time. The end of trial by ordeal marks a turning point in Western legal history. It represents the moment when law began separating from religion, when courts stopped invoking God directly and started relying on human institutions and reasoning. It's part of the gradual secularization of European society that would eventually produce the Enlightenment and modern legal systems. But it's worth remembering that the people who used trial by ordeal weren't stupid or primitive. They were operating from different premises about how the world worked and what justice meant. They believed God was actively present in the world and would intervene to protect the innocent. Given that belief, trial by ordeal was logical. And they developed a system that, through a combination of psychology, ritual, and priestly discretion, actually worked better than random chance. It identified guilty parties who confessed under pressure. It protected many innocent people who passed the ordeal. And it provided social legitimacy to outcomes in a way that mere human judgment couldn't. When we look at trial by ordeal today, we should see it not as evidence of medieval ignorance, but as evidence of human ingenuity. They had a problem: how to determine truth when evidence is insufficient. They had a set of beliefs: God knows truth and will reveal it. And they designed a system that used religious ritual, psychological pressure, and interpretive flexibility to produce outcomes that the community would accept. It wasn't perfect. Nothing is. But it was rational within its own framework. And it worked well enough to persist for over 500 years across all of Christian Europe. The real lesson from trial by ordeal isn't that medieval people were superstitious fools. It's that every justice system, including ours, is built on premises that future generations might find absurd. We believe that 12 random citizens can evaluate complex evidence and reach correct verdicts. We believe that professional judges can set aside their biases and rule impartially. We believe that the adversarial system, where two lawyers argue their cases, will somehow produce truth. Are these beliefs more rational than believing God will protect the innocent from burning? Maybe. But they're still beliefs, still premises that we accept because our system is built on them, not because we've proven they're absolutely true. Trial by ordeal ended in 1215. But the search for perfect justice continues. And 800 years from now, people might look back at our trials, our juries, our evidence rules, and see them as quaintly primitive attempts to solve the eternal problem of knowing truth and administering justice. Just like we look at medieval people grasping red-hot iron and trusting God to reveal guilt or innocence.